From Perry Mason to LA Law to the entire Law and Order franchise, people love a good procedural. But when it comes to showing how the law really works, how accurate are they? And how do people's perceptions of what they see on screen influence what happens in the courtroom? Hello, and welcome to The On-Ramp, an ongoing series that highlights thought leadership from Suffolk University in downtown Boston. My name is Francisca Beduya, and today I'll be speaking with Professor Stephanie Jirard. She's an assistant professor in the Political Science and Legal Studies program here at Suffolk, as well as a former federal prosecutor and public defender. She's done extensive research on how media perceptions of race and gender can influence how defendants are treated in real courtrooms. Professor Jirard, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
I'm honored by the invitation.
Of course. So let's start from the beginning. What sparked your interest in law?
Like most people, I chose a career from an early age. And I was in grade school. I think I was in the 6th grade when I first learned about American slavery. And I was struck by the power of how, with the stroke of a pen, you could determine the entire trajectory of someone's life based on skin color alone. Because the law really dictated, let's just take the antebellum South for an example, how you were born, if you were educated, what you ate, who and how you could get married, if your children could be sold as chattel property, where you could be buried, and all of this was determined by the law. And I thought to myself, I need to learn the power of these words. I need some power like this. So that's what really sparked my interest.
No, that's incredible. In addition to learning about law, you also are an expert in media of law. How do those two intersect?
Well, the first, media and, of course, law are hugely powerful in our society. And it goes back, I think, the first intersection goes back to the kidnapping, if you will, of Charles Lindbergh Jr., which happened in March of 1932. Now, Charles Lindbergh was a national hero because he had flown solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And this was a first in 1927. So the kidnapping of his son, who was just a little shy of his 2nd birthday, was a national event, really widely covered by the media. And the intersection of media and law was in June of that year of 1932, Congress enacted a kidnapping law that made the crime of kidnapping a federal offense. And they named it the Lindbergh Act. So this, I think, is a wonderful example of, and because it happens all the time, of how the intersection of media and law actually works.
So what is the power of media when it comes to how law enforcement is portrayed?
So you know, as a student of media, you get to spend time, perfecting your craft. In print media, you get time to choose your words. In TV and film media, it's all about production values. Lighting, costumes, scripts, music, and all of it's done to evoke a certain emotional response. And in general, law enforcement is portrayed well. And I'm not talking about what the public is capturing on their cell phones, the police-citizen encounters that are somewhat troubling. I'm not necessarily talking about that, because that, of course, is covered by the media, but that's captured by people on the street. An example I can give you about an effective and a positive law enforcement portrayal is the show Criminal Minds. Now, the show itself is filled with gruesome crimes. It's really not for like primetime viewing. It's gory. But the show begins with, a gruesome killing, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, has this unit of behavioral profilers. They're, figuring out who committed the crime by doing this psychological autopsy, if you will. The semiotics, that is communication through signs of this show, particularly in transmitting how favorable law enforcement is that after the gruesome killing, you see the team, the behavioral unit, get together on a Lear jet. And they're flying high above the clouds. And then there's some quote by some famous person, like Madame Curie or Albert Einstein. And this indicates to the public by this semiotic rendering that the team, law enforcement, flies high above the clouds and that they have above average intelligence and they're smarter than us. And so I think in these shows, law enforcement is generally portrayed favorably because of that, because you have the time and the means to structure it well.
Are there any negative examples you can think of?
There are many, but they typically draw from what you find on the street in terms of everyday interactions. Typically in the shows where law enforcement is portrayed negatively, there's typically always an arc, a storytelling arc, where we end on a positive note. So even though, of course, all law enforcement are people, we're reflected there. Robert Peel, who's determined to be the father of modern policing, in 1829 came up with this saying, the police are the public are the police. So we are them and they are us. All of their foibles, all of their weaknesses are reflected in us, the public. And so sure, there's negativity, but it's always a redemptive arc, at least in terms of how the media can portray them.
And beyond just entertainment, what role does the news media play in shaping how crimes are judged as well?
So the news media in judging crimes, again, you know that there's an adage, if it bleeds, it leads. And what that means is essentially if it's sensational, that's going to draw people's attention. And I think back again as a history major to the times of Jack the Ripper in London in the summer of 1888, just a sensational crime. Today, using a modern example of how news media can shape how crimes are judged, I look at the medical problem of drug addiction. Drug addiction is drug addiction is drug addiction, and it requires a medical response. But in the news media, if you look at how things were portrayed in the 1980s, for example, that's my generation, there was a crack epidemic. Now, crack is diluted cocaine, and it really infected inner cities, really destroyed communities, because it was cheap, and people could get it for a cheap high. But if you look historically, the news media portrayed this health epidemic as a real serious crime epidemic. Now, we're going to shift quite differently to the opioid and fentanyl crisis of the modern day. Now here, opioids overprescribed to many people and they became addicted. And when they could no longer get those opioids, they turned to synthetic heroin, which is fentanyl. Now fentanyl has killed 10 times the amount of people that the crack cocaine crisis did.
Wow.
But it's portrayed in the news media as a health crisis. Why? Because the social demographics of who's being affected are not necessarily from the city. It's a rural population, suburban problem. So the news media has cast and judged these crimes very differently. The same can be said for gun violence. Gun violence, if you see it reported by the news media in the inner city, it's a bunch of thugs who are terrorizing people. It's reported quite differently by people who commit gun violence in schools, malls, they shoot up churches. Typically, those people, by the news media, are held blameless. They're suffering for some mental health crisis. They are not cast in this negative aspersion of being a thug and a terrorist who has destroyed communities. These lone wolves, because they don't come from the inner city, are cast quite differently by the media. So that's how news media framing can judge how the crimes are perceived.
Yeah, there's a lot of power there. Another recent example would be the Karen Reed trial as well, which took place just a few miles from here. What struck you about the coverage that trial got as well?
Well, the Karen Reed trial, it was very different. And so it had a lot of different pieces, which created its sensationalism in terms of the media. Number one, you had a police officer victim. And in the criminal justice system, the victim's status usually drives the prosecution. So you had a high status victim. You also had an unusual defendant in that it was a suburban woman charged with murder, and that rarely happens. It happens, but it's rare. So you had that unusual piece. You also had the piece of investigator malfeasance that was exposed when one of the lead investigators' text messages had been publicized, and you got an inside scoop as to what he really thought of the defendant and the evidence. So here you have investigators who are supposed to be fair and impartial, and you're wondering now, do they really put their thumb on the scale of justice by really what they really think? So all of those dynamics played into why the government was unsuccessful in prosecuting Karen Read twice. And that's how she was acquitted of the most serious charges in that case.
Yeah, and it was really on every news stream, all over social media. It was an enormous case. That was,
yes.
was incredibly powerful. So you also have powerful firsthand experience in the courtroom. In the past, you represented indigent clients in the death penalty cases. What was that experience like?
Well, when I first started practice, I was a death penalty supporter. Mm-hmm. And like most people, when you actually get experienced in the field in which you work, your attitudes can change. And that happened to me. So what I learned is that the death penalty, in my experience, is a punishment reserved exclusively for people without money. Mm-hmm. And I always say, I challenge anyone to prove me wrong. And I'm not talking about, oh, I own my house money. I'm talking real money. Because the real killers who have resources are typically allowed to plead out or to get charged with lesser offenses. They're not getting executed. Mm. So it changed my perception in a bit, because I didn't realize when I, again, started being a lawyer that the prosecutor is the most powerful person in the criminal justice system. Mm. They alone get to decide who to charge with crimes and what crimes to charge. And so I found that there was a fundamental unfairness in the way the death penalty was applied.
How did that experience shape your view of the criminal legal system as a whole?
Yes, it changed the way that I look at cases, in particular because I didn't realize at the time that the death penalty decision is typically reserved just for one person. Mm-hmm. And that one person is typically an elected official at the state level, the district attorney, or the prosecutor. And I'll give you an example of how powerful this decision is in terms of the death penalty. There was a very famous defendant, my generation, not yours, O.J. Simpson. And O.J. Simpson was a famous football player, celebrity, and he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing his ex-wife, Nicole, and her friend, Ron Goldman. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the crime scene photos, this was a gruesome killing. And typically in California, which has the biggest death row in the country, they have no qualms about seeking the death penalty in a gruesome double murder such as this. Mm-hmm. But the way the death penalty works is to get on a death penalty jury. Mm-hmm. The very first question you're asked is, are you willing to kill the defendant? Because the only way you get on that jury to impose the death penalty is you have to declare your willingness to execute the defendant, even before you've heard one shred of evidence.
Yeah.
So studies show that juries who are going to impose the death penalty rarely think about innocence or guilt. Mm-hmm. That is, their focus is on, does the defendant live or die? So Gil Garcetti, who was the district attorney of Los Angeles at the time O.J. Simpson committed these murders, decided not to seek the death penalty in O.J. Simpson case. In that one decision alone, not to seek death, allowed O.J. Simpson to be tried by a regular jury, a jury that could consider innocence or guilt. Mm-hmm. And because of that one decision, O.J. Simpson was acquitted. And of course, I think, had Gil Garcetti sought the death penalty against O.J. Simpson, I don't think the jury would have killed O.J. I don't think they would have executed him. He was immensely popular, but studies show overwhelmingly he most likely would have been convicted of those double murders by that one decision alone. So how the death penalty, and again, I'm not here to change people's opinion about the death penalty. I myself am an abolitionist, but that's just me. It's not necessarily a view that I try to get people to join me in thinking that way. But I think it showed me that justice can be twisted depending on how people in power make certain decisions.
Yeah, and what are other factors besides power or money that play into that role?
So I think, in my experience, people seeking the death penalty, again, prosecutors seeking the death penalty, know that they are high-powered cases that draw media attention, lots of media attention. And again, we always have to give homage to the victims of these cases. Typically, we're always focused on the defendants, but these are tragic cases. No, there's no question about it. But sort of the media exposure that one gets when the death penalty is pursued, what the evidence may or may not be and get introduced in death penalty cases, the resources, as I said, of the defendant, how can they fight a capital murder case? Those types of factors that people don't generally see, I think, go into the death penalty calculus. And what I'll say is there's thousands and thousands of murderers in America every year who don't get the death penalty. It's justice in those cases just to sentence the person to life without parole, or to sentence them to prison. So justice isn't necessarily exclusive in the death penalty itself. So those are the other factors that I think go into that calculation.
Of course. And you've been in the field for a long time now. You have tons of experience. What changes have you noticed in the media over time?
Yes, well, you have a very crowded media market now.
Of course.
And so there's a lot of, like I said, sensationalism that you need to attract the public's attention, especially with respect to social media and with respect to the internet. People generally are not going to stay on stories for very long. So you have to be able to engage them very quickly. So the biggest change I've seen is not only that social media has exploded, but everyday people can put their opinions on social media, or bots, if you will, to influence how people's opinions play out. And so people, especially around criminal justice issues, are heavily influenced in what they get on the internet in a way that wasn't prevalent when I practiced years ago.
Of course. So speaking of something that influenced you, a fun fact about you is that you're an expert on the courtroom series Perry Mason. Would you care to tell us more about that?
Well, I understand that your generation hasn't even probably seen a Perry Mason show, and if you have, it's been in reruns. And Perry Mason, for, again, people my generation, was hugely influential. Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the United States Supreme Court, during her confirmation hearings, mentioned Perry Mason's influence. And so it was a show that ran from 1957 to 1966. And it only had one episode in color. So 271 episodes for 9 years. It was all in black and white. But the thing that Perry Mason brought into people's living rooms every week was that you are innocent until proven guilty. And the concepts of due process, because it was a courtroom drama. Due process is about fairness, the constitutional protections. You have a right to remain silent. You have a right to assistance of counsel. People learned about those concepts through Perry Mason, and more recently, Law and Order, that everyone is innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt through the introduction of sufficient evidence. These highbrow legal concepts were brought in to the TV sets that people watched and could discuss with their families and friends that didn't really happen before Perry Mason. So he's like a watershed cultural figure. And in today's legal procedurals, you will see Perry Mason's DNA in all of them. And really what he stood for is the ideal that justice is for everybody.
Of course. Well, I feel as though I need to watch an episode now. I've enjoyed our discussion so much. Thank you for being here.
It's so nice to have met you. And please do keep in touch.
Of course. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on The On-Ramp.